Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Centre for the first of our new Tuesday series. These sessions, of course, have become something of a tradition here at the Centre, and the previous 3 semesters were dedicated to an exploration of the concepts of beauty, goodness and truth, those notions that have lain at the core of USD since its founding in 1949. As many of you here will know, that 3-semester project was undertaken in no small part to rescue those concepts from the treatment they are in danger of receiving from time to time, reduced from inherently complex, contested and historically determined ideas to banal slogans and sound bites. The prolonged analysis given to each of those ideas was intended to prevent any such simplistic usage. It was a bittersweet moment for me then when I arrived back after summer break and saw campus festooned with a new batch of banners, one of which simply declared beauty, goodness and truth, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. So, undeterred by the manifest futility of my work, I'm here today to introduce this new series, which will once again be intent upon probing a multifaceted and contested idea, namely that of the afterlife. It's precisely because such a notion is subject to multiple interpretations and markedly various constructions that we have called the series Afterlives. This preserves the essentially and inherently plural nature of the concept, which over the next few weeks will be addressed from a number of perspectives and disciplines. Now, as well as being the sort of topic perfectly suited to this kind of lengthy exploration, this subject was chosen because it complements a major piece of Humanities Centre programming undertaken this semester. Dr. Antonieta Mercado, one of our very special guests this afternoon, is the curator of a week-long celebration of the Day of the Dead that will run here from October 28th to November the 1st, titled Dia de Muertos, Ancestral Tradition and Cultural Transformation Across Borders. This extraordinary series of events is detailed in the Humanities Centre Spring Calendar, which you should all pick up. One of our gallery's 2 exhibitions this semester is also pertinent to that series of programming and to the Afterlives series. Political Skeletons, the Art and Afterlife of Jose Guadalupe Posada, centres on the iconic work and influence of Posada. Antonieta and I would like to thank Derek Cartwright, John Murphy and Catherine Powers Noland for their work in putting together what promises to be a fascinating and provocative exhibition. A couple of further words about this afternoon's speakers. Dr. Mercado, already mentioned, is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies. She earned her PhD from UC San Diego and joined USD's faculty in 2012. Her work focuses on the communication and citizenship practices of Mexican indigenous immigrants in the United States and how these practices extend to the transnational public sphere. In addition to work published in leading communication journals, she's worked as a freelance journalist. It's Dr. Mercado's remarkable on-campus work on the Day of the Dead, organised every year, that has been the inspiration and the guiding light for this semester's programming here on death and immortality. Joining us also this afternoon is Dr. Malachi Black. Dr. Black is Assistant Professor of English, joining the USD faculty in 2014. He received his PhD from the University of Utah and is an accomplished and award-winning poet. Dr. Black's first collection, Storm Toward Morning, was a finalist for the Poetry Society of America's Norma Farber First Book Award and has been described by reviewers as brilliant, beautiful, and manifesting the same kind of complexity, struggle, and wrenching feeling as found in the work of John Donne, no less. Among his many fellowships and awards, Dr. Black is a 2019 National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellow. His contributions to these series are always memorable, so it's lovely to have him with us here again. Thank you both. As regular attendees of our previous series will know, the format of each session is to hear from 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 speakers and then have a general Q&A session at the end. We're going to forego the formal Q&A session today because we have a nice reception following to which you're all invited. If you do have questions, then you can raise those with the speakers over a glass of Chardonnay or whatever you fancy. The gallery will also be open during the course of the reception, and there's a really remarkable video installation in the gallery by Jatovia Gary, who will be visiting us on September 25th. So do stay and look at this. Derek would kill me if I neglected to say, no food or drink in the gallery at all, not even a trace on your clothing. So the overarching theme of this series is the impression that death makes upon human thought and imagination. Human responses to death are, of course, highly varied, but a degree of anxiety will not unusually be present. We worry about our own mortality, and we're distressed by the deaths of others, principally of those that we love. Now, a fairly dramatic representation of this anxiety is found in Blaise Pascal's troubled and troubling words about the prospect of death. The last act is bloody. However fine the rest of the play, they throw earth over your head, and it is finished forever. Things will get more upbeat, as we all think. They won't, actually. I mean, you saw the poster. It's like when you walked in the door, you knew what to expect. But this thought of Pascal's is a beautiful sort of Pascalian moment. He's a really wonderful writer, of course. This thought encapsulates 2 distinct and specific fears about death: the pain accompanying the process of dying and the total finality of our life's eclipse. It will be over. And such dreadful thoughts have agitated the greatest of minds. There's a terrific passage in Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, about this. This is Dostoevsky. He's actually dead in this picture. And this is early on in The Idiot, where he's talking about the horrors of torture. So take, for instance, torture. You get suffering, wounds, bodily agony, all of which distracts the mind from mental suffering. For up to the very moment of your death, you are only tormented by your wounds. This is the important bit. The chief and the worst pain is perhaps not inflicted by wounds, but by your certain knowledge that in an hour, in 10 minutes, in half a minute, now, this moment, your soul will fly out of your body, and that you will be a human being no longer. More recently, the neuroscientist David Eagleman, in a really fascinating book called Some, which I do sort of recommend heartily. Eagleman there articulates the awful thought of being forgotten in his enumeration of the 3 deaths. So there are 3 deaths. The first is when the body ceases to function. The second is when the body is consigned to the grave. The third is that moment sometime in the future when your name is spoken for the last time. Now, there seem to be 3 ways. I mean, face this anxiety of death, the suffering of death, and our being forgotten years after our death. Yes, that thing's, it's hard not to ignore that thing about being forgotten. When I was back in England recently, I was looking over a family tree that had been done by a relative, and it went back, 400, 500 years. And no, they're just names now, and they're just names that I've seen for the first time. And they're completely forgotten, but they had the same kind of hopes and fears and anxieties that I do, and yet I'll be a family tree in about 500 years' time, I'll have the same effect. I'll just be a kind of forgotten Clack. And he said, these are terrible anxieties. And how do we deal with this stuff? There seem to be three pathways for dealing with anxiety about death. The first is to avoid thinking about death altogether. This is what Pascal says is what we typically do. Being unable to cure death, wretchedness and ignorance, men have decided, in order to be happy, not to think about such things. In Pascal's way of talking about this is typically done by the pursuit of diversions of one kind or another. He says here, we run heedlessly into the abyss after putting something in front of us to stop us seeing it. That's one way we could do it, by the development of these diversions, or perhaps by fooling ourselves into thinking that death is something that happens to other people and not to ourselves. This is an evasive strategy that is exposed systematically by the philosopher Martin Heidegger in his very important book, Being and Time. Now, for obvious reasons, this has been held to be the least philosophically respectable of the three responses to death. Not thinking about something seems to be completely unphilosophical. On the other hand, there are perhaps good reasons for not endlessly poring over one's mortal condition. Here's the great Emily du Châtelet in the wonderful discourse on happiness. And she says, death is an idea that always distresses us, whether we foresee our own or that of, or think of that of the people we love. So we must avoid with care all that can remind us of this idea. It is folly to poison with this sad and humiliating idea part of the little time we have to live. Now, gloomy philosophers might look down their nose at this kind of attitude, but there's something in it. Life, after all, is very short. So why waste it and throw away all of its potential, though admittedly transient joys, by spending all your time on morbid thoughts? It's better to eat, drink, and be merry, etc., etc. As I say, people like Heidegger will sort of dismiss this idea. But her point, which we'll return to, is actually that nothing can really prepare you for this. You don't know what it's going to be like when it comes, so why waste your time trying to prepare yourself for it? There are joys to be had in life, and so on. Now, a second way of dealing with death's inescapability has been to develop a calm acceptance of our mortal condition. So you can accept it, resign yourself to it, and come to terms with it in that way. There have been two principal varieties of this approach, the Stoic and the Epicurean. The ancient philosophy of Stoicism operates in part upon a distinction between things that are in our power and things that are not in our power. It's reasonable to be concerned with those things that fall within our power to alter, but it's futile to fret over those things that lie outside of our control. This is what's recommended by Epictetus. Whenever any problem arises, say, can I do anything about this? Yes, then I should think about acting. If the answer is no, then I just have to accept it. Since death falls squarely into the category of things we cannot control, the attitude a person takes towards it should be one of calm and resigned acceptance. There's something dignified about this approach. The alternative to Stoicism from the ancient world, of course, is Epicureanism, and the Epicurean alternative stresses the irrationality of fearing death. Epicurus' point is that evil things are only certain kinds of sensations. Since death is the end of all sensations, there is no evil here to be rationally feared. I can justifiably and rationally fear things that will happen to me, being humiliated in public, losing my job, becoming homeless, and so on, because all of those are states in which I could be feeling pain of some kind. I would be in a state of joblessness, homelessness, humiliation, and so on. But I can never be in a state of death. Or at least I can never experience the state of being dead. So it's nothing to worry about. Here's Epicurus himself, in his own words, death is nothing to us. since while we exist, death is not present, and whenever death is present, we do not exist. It is nothing either to the living or the dead, since it does not exist for the living, and the dead no longer are. Moreover, to such ancient proponents of acceptance, our condition after death is as little to be feared as our condition before our birth. And nobody ever worries about not existing before they were born. We worry about not existing after death, but I don't fret about, 1966. That's a terrifying thought. I mean, some people might. I mean, part of Pascal's horror about life is that it's such a tiny little blip, and that the past centuries where you weren't there are something that cause a sense of dreadful anxiety. But most of us don't worry too much about that. We worry about what's going to happen 50 years from hence when we're not there. This is what Plutarch's concerned about, or is trying to offset that concern. It says, those who have died return to the same state in which they were before birth. Therefore, as nothing was either good or evil for us before birth, even so will it be with us after death. And just as all events before our lifetime were nothing to us, even so will all events subsequent to our lifetime be nothing to us. Lovely thoughts. He additionally observes that death can only be akin, if it's anything, it can only be akin to a very deep sleep, a nice, unbroken slumber of the type we all long for when we go to bed at night. As he says, if death is asleep, as we often say it is, and there's nothing evil in the state of those who sleep, it's evident that there is likewise nothing evil in the state of those who are dead. Nay, what need is there even to state that the deepest sleep is indeed the sweetest? This is a really good point. And one of the things I long for most of all these days is a good night's sleep. And I wish I didn't have to set my alarm clock. Now, this is what Plutarch says is the best way of thinking about death. Death is just sleep without an alarm clock waking you up. And therefore, it's something not just to be accepting of, but in many ways to be positively looking forward to. Now, opinions differ on the effectiveness of these attempts at acceptance. Now, all of this, you see, is supposed to be, here's some rational argument why you shouldn't worry about it. Many people have found these things successful. Others have been less impressed. Here's de la Rochefoucauld, fantastic portrait of de la Rochefoucauld there. And he's, in the Maxims, he's talking a lot about the futility of these strategies and remedies. He says that these attitudes towards death offer the kind of comfort often given in war by a simple hedge to those obliged to advance towards the enemy's fire. From a distance, you imagine it must provide cover, but when you come near, you find it gives little help. In other words, these philosophical remedies sound great in the seminar room, but they have little power when the dreadful moment itself arrives. They may have no force at all. Now, it was a suspicion of this character that led the great Samuel Johnson to his conclusion that only a religious solution, only the promise of some states beyond this earthly life, was what could truly ease the terrors of death. He says, lovely essay, Consolation in the Face of Death. Real alleviation of the loss of friends and rational tranquility in the prospect of our own dissolution can be received only from the promises of him in whose hands are life and death, and from the assurance of another and better state, in which all tears will be wiped from the eyes, and the whole soul shall be filled with joy. Philosophy may infuse stubbornness, but religion only can give patience. So here's the third way of offsetting the anxiety of death. It's not that you don't think about it, it's not that you calmly accept it, it's that you look for something else and something better, and it's the promise of that thing beyond the moment of death, which you will experience, which alone can give that kind of easing of anxiety. Well, that point may be persuasive, maybe it is only the promise of a continued and perhaps more fulfilling life in one way or another that can quiet these anxieties about our mortality. And yet it does have to be noted that even if we accept that, the heavy work still has to be done. And the heavy work consists of answering a whole set of questions, and here's a sample of them. can an intelligible account of a life after death be provided? What would it be like? Would it be a spiritual, bodiless existence, or a physical one, in which we again have bodies, but perhaps of a different kind? Are there any good reasons for thinking that a life after death is likely, or even possible? Is there any evidence for it? How does that evidence stand with regard to evidence against there being a life after death? No less significant, how would an eternity of continued existence not become boring? I mean, a great many people, after all, find themselves bored on a rainy Sunday afternoon. So it doesn't go without saying that an endless amount of days going on and on and on would not become absolutely insufferable for anyone. Now, over the course of the next few weeks, we'll be looking at some of these questions, and a lot more, all of which spill out from the confrontation of the human imagination with our felt sense of transience and mortality. Now, I hope you'll come along every Tuesday and join in these conversations with a great variety of voices from campus. And now, after that, I want to turn things over to the first of my wonderful co-presenters, Dr. Antonieta Mercado.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I would like to start my presentation with a quote. I will tell you who wrote this quote, but it's a little bit long quote. This is the thank you. It says, the word death is not pronounced in New York, in Paris, in London, because it burns the lips. The Mexican, in contrast, is familiar with death, jokes about it, caresses it, sleeps with it, celebrates it. It is one of his favorite toys and his most steadfast love. Mexico is a country seduced by death, in which the extinction of life is a theme continually present in our songs, fiestas, proverbs, and popular beliefs. These are the words of Mexican Nobel Prize Octavio Paz, who, being born in Mexico, paradoxically explored the Day of the Dead as a casual outsider. As a criollo from the upper class, his explanation corresponds more to the grand narratives of revolutionary nationalism, an official ideology that tried to unify Mexico around a single ethnic and even racial identity after the Mexican Revolution, something famously known or infamously known as mestizaje. At the end of the day, the concept of death for people living in Mexico has been reshaped by government institutions, the media, popular culture, the school, and the church. At the same time, different rituals have been preserved in different communities in Mexico. The Mexican state that came from the Mexican Revolution that happened roughly 100 years ago used this celebration to define Mexicanness, whatever that is. I was born in what is known now in Mexico, and promoted the Day of the Dead as a tourist attraction for outsiders. The Mexican state of the 20th century, which is where I was educated, drew its meaning from the revolution. These are some illustrations that we're going to have an exhibit about in the next few months by journalist and cartoonist Jose Guadalupe Posada, who printed images of death to criticize the upper classes during the pre-revolutionary years. You're probably very familiar with these images, right? Some of those images are very famous. They have taken on by popular culture, by some corporations even. So I wanted to show you these. This is a Day of the Dead altar, right? I took this picture last November when I was in Oaxaca City. This was the main altar in the city. But I wanted to show you this photo. This is from the Mexican Revolution. This is Fortino Samano. It's a photo from 1916. He was about to be killed, right? He was about to be executed. And as the Mexican state drew its meaning from the revolution, right? The revolution provided a lot of images of death. So it got further complicated about defining the culture of the community, right? We all are familiar with Benedict Anderson when he talked about imagined communities that create nations. So this happened to the Mexican nation, right? The Day of the Dead was very important, has been very important to define Mexicanness. In this image, Fortino Samano is finishing a cigar, right? And the culture say this is an image from Archivo Casasola, and the story says that he asked the executioners to wait until he finished the cigar, and he looked at them directly with that bravado and said, "Hey, bring it on," right? And this is an excerpt of a corrido from that time, from the Mexican Revolution. It's called the Valentina, right? It's a soldier who is singing his praises to his beloved girlfriend named Valentina. And the song, well, I'm not going to sing it, but it is it's a rhythm, right? This is a poem. But basically says, Valentina, I surrender at your feet. If they are to kill me tomorrow, let them kill me today once for all. Bring it on, right? Those are stereotypes, right? Those are creations that were embedded in the culture as Mexico has imagined it itself, as a uniform nation with deep roots in indigenous cultures. But the problem with all these characterizations by, the intellectual of the country, which in this case is Octavio Paz, was that it seems that he passed by without really knowing what was what the death meant for Mexicans and for a lot of people in Mexico. Mexico has 68 different indigenous groups, 68 different histories of creation, right? 68 different languages. So this is why when I talk about Mexico, I always say what is now known as Mexico, right? It was a process. This celebration, Day of the Dead, or the celebration of death, it is embedded in the process of creating a nation, but it's not necessarily its authenticity, right? Or it is hard to prove the authenticity of anything, right? So let's go. I think I was talking to you early before I started, and let's complicate this, right? And you asked me, what is the worst question that I can ask you? And I said, define in a phrase what the Day of the Dead means, because it's complex, right? That's actually a very, very hard question to ask. This illustration is showing one of the myths of creation. This is Quetzalcoatl, the feather serpent. The feather serpent shows in a lot of creation stories in the native population of the hemisphere, right? Even the Kumeya, in which land we are now gathering, they have a story related to the serpent, feather serpent. It's different, but it's sort of, it has some similarities. They share some similarities, but they are different, right? Essentially different. Well, this is a creation myth for the Nahua. This is Quetzalcoatl, and according to the legend, Quetzalcoatl went to the region of death to meet Mictlantecutli, which is the other deity. I don't call them gods. We're not talking about religion per se right now. We're talking about spirituality, and I'm going there now. I call them deities. It's much more complex when we think about these deities as gods or goddesses. Then we start going into westernized ways of seeing it. It's way more complex than that. Quetzalcoatl, Mictlantecutli were deities that also change gender, right? And sometimes we learn about them as if they were a couple when they were the same deity, right? Mictlancihuatl and Mictlantecutli were the same, they were not a couple. So this is a story of creation, right? Quetzalcoatl goes to the underworld, gathers the bones of humans to create the fifth son, which is the time that we live on, now according to the Nahua, and according to the Mayans. And Mictlantecutli decided that they didn't want the creation of the new world, but Quetzalcoatl trickles Mictlantecutli and robs the bones and the seeds of corn. So corn is very, very, very important in the ceremonies for the dead. It's sort of a cycle. It is not what Dr. Clack was talking about was this meditation about death from the individual mind, right? What happens when I cease to exist? This is more of a communal conception of death, right? What happens in the world? What is our conception of community? And this is where I would like to move on with my presentation. This is an example of an altar in Chiapas. It's full of flowers and it's full of corn. Corn is very, very important in the stories of creation and in the ceremonies for the death, right? Of course, I get this question all the time, but isn't the Day of the Dead part of the Catholic tradition? Yes, it is, right? But it hasn't been forever, right? There was a moment, the same moment that happened during the Mexican Revolution, right? That things started to mix. It happened during the colonial times when the festivities of Mictlantecutli and Quetzalcoatl got brought into the Catholic Church, right? So the festivities that sometimes lasted 3 months and were linked to the harvest of the corn, right? The beginning of when people plant the corn and the flowers that are going to be in the altars, people started to think about the death, right? As part of the community. But that was very strange for Europeans who came, and they decided, well, we're gonna move it to the All Saints' Day, right? You're gonna have your celebration, but it's not gonna be 3 months or 4 months. It's going to be a day, 1 day, or 2 days, right? And it's the Day of the Dead, as we know it. So this is another iteration. That's why I told you it's hard to say, right, what is authentic and what is not. So it has been known, it is in the fall, and it is in, for the Catholic tradition, is celebrated on November 1 and 2. This holiday, or this, I wouldn't say holiday, this celebration is so extraordinary and so artistic that now we're learning about it through communication corporations, right, to media corporations. And one of them is Disney Corporation, but it's plenty of Hollywood take on the Day of the Dead. In Mexico, the Mexican government was already shaping the Day of the Dead as a Mexican holiday, despite the fact that it is celebrated in different ways in Peru or in Colombia or in Guatemala, but they branded it as a Mexican holiday, right? And they said, well, because of those, because we don't fear death. You saw the image of the revolutionary guy with his cigar, right? Because this is the uniqueness, but that was branding. So this is the same thing is happening right now, and I get always asked, what is going to happen with the spiritual side of the celebration, right? We're losing it. Oh my God, we're losing the spiritual side of the Day of the Dead because of those corporations. In some ways, we are revaluing the complexity of it. The thirst of these corporations for grabbing the Day of the Dead, right? I don't know if you remember in 2013, Disney tried to copyright it, the phrase, Dia de los Muertos, because they were already doing products like water bottles, backpacks, yes, because they were creating a movie. They were so heavily criticized by the Mexican and Mexican-American community that they back off. There were 5 or 6 copyright suits on May 2013. They back off, they let the other company, 21st Century Fox, have their movie, right, 2014, and then they did a very interesting move, they hired their critics, right? San Diego cartoonist Lalo Alcaraz was a very, very harsh critic of Disney, was hired to be part of the cultural consultant, right, as a cultural consultant for Coco. And they named the movie, they just move away from the Day of the Dead, right? They named it Coco. They made it very interesting with a lot of elements of that image that I was telling you, right? Sort of the mestizo 20th century image of what the celebration is. They went to Mexico and they sort of portrayed that. And they also made a very interesting move. They opened the movie in 2017 in Mexico. So all the press that was coming out of the opening of the movie said, hey, Mexicans love it. It's very authentic. It's very good if you haven't seen it. How many of you have seen Coco? Oh, almost all of you. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you to watch the movie. It has a lot of the elements, but you know, I cannot think about the movie without thinking about the controversy. But anyway, something almost to wrap up my presentation, something that I have been wondering. You know, I'm coming back from my sabbatical, and I spent a few months visiting Day of the Dead celebrations, mainly in Oaxaca, but also in the state of Mexico, Puebla, and in other parts of Mexico. And something that was very, very clear to me this time is that what makes the difference in this celebration is the conception of community that comes from the native people from the hemisphere, right, from indigenous people. So for us, and I will totally out myself here, but for Westernized and Western conceptions of community, a community is a unified body of individuals or a group of people with a common characteristic of interest living together with a larger society. And that, the third one, is the community is a place where I come to have a dialogue with others with the understanding, with the almost security that they are going to understand me, that I will be understood. And that's a very Habermasian, and I'm a communication scholar, and I come from that tradition. It's the public sphere, right? We have all these tools, and we come together as community, and we have a dialogue, and we meet each other and communicate with each other. That doesn't happen. For indigenous communities, the conception of community is intersubjective. It has three parts, three-dimensional. It's the relationship you have with each other, with other humans, and then the relationship you have, I met a philosopher, Juan Jose Bautista calls it, or siblings, right? Or human siblings, siblings of nature, animals, trees, the rivers, Mother Nature as a whole, and then or spiritual siblings, or ancestors. And that's where this whole celebration has a different dimension, right? Because, and it's interesting because Coco, the movie, actually captures that. They went to Mexico and they talked about it, and it's practice, right? Juan Jose Bautista puts it in like as simple terms for us to understand, but if you go to the communities, to indigenous communities in the continent, you see it as a practice. These three elements are going together, right? So you have your relationship with others, relationship with nature, with the trees, with the harvest, with corn, right? With the things you eat, with the things that go back into the earth, which is sometimes we have to go back into the earth, and you come back as the best corn, right? Or as corn for the next year, for the next harvest. And you are always remembered because you are always coming back in that cycle, right? It's not a sort of a wandering of the mind, but it's a cycle of nature, right? And we are all inserted in that cycle. So, last but not least, I was actually concerned about my poster because it seems very colorful, and the other posters seem very somber, and it's a somber topic, but at the same time it's very colorful. So I invite all of you to follow the series for End of Life series, but also to come for a deeper discussion about Day of the Dead. We're going to have a week-long event starting in October 28th and going all the way to November 1st. And we're going to have a lot of art, exhibit of prints by Jose Guadalupe Posada. And, I invite you to to join us. Those are some of the speakers who will come. I always think that the best, the people who have captured that essence for the Day of the Dead are popular culture artists, artisans and crafters, right? So those are some of the speakers who will come. Leonardo Linares, who is from the Linares family, who are the ones who created skulls and paper mache alebrijes, which is a very interesting kind of animal. You see it there. Natalia Toledo, who is a poet, a Zapotec poet. Guillermo Marin, who will talk about the philosophical concept of death in the region of the Anahuac, which is interesting, right? He says that the Anahuac comes all the way from Nicaragua to Alaska, so we're part of the Anahuac. It'll be interesting to listen to him. And Daniel Isai, who creates these beautiful pieces. So those are some of the speakers who will come, and I highly recommend you to attend the series. Thank you.
I want to begin, of course, by thanking Brian and Antonieta both for your phenomenal presentations and for putting me in a very precarious situation. Brian, I want to extend a reduplicated thanks for having me this afternoon. And of course, I want to extend those thanks to all of you for accompanying us and for everybody associated with the Humanities Center, not least Lindy, Dean Norton. Thanks to you all. It's a pleasure, but because we're talking about death, we're going to begin in sorrow. I hope you can excuse that. It's my nature, really. I was thinking about this issue. Brian extended the invitation toward the latter portion of the summer, so I had a lot of time to steep in the very cold, dark pool of mortal fear and terror. And I was trying to think, well, maybe I should begin by reminding everybody who accompanies me this afternoon about the nature of the mortal predicament. And it happens that I find really compelling a theologian, actually, Lutheran by training, named Paul Tillich, who offers a summary that I just can't seem to escape, which is that we go towards something that is not yet, and we come from something that is no more. I think poets in particular are very aware of this component of mortality, which is temporality, the brevity of our experience, and the mystery that we have, as Tillich says, a present at all. I think it's William James who defines the specious present, the experience that there is a continuity in our experience. He limits it at, I think it's 6 seconds. That's what now is in his estimation. And so we're always on a moving, component of 6 seconds as the train car ferrets first. Well, great. Tillich says, well, we have a present so mysterious. We should feel great about it, right? We have a present at all. How wonderful to be cognizant and not have my atoms in the shape of this table. But of course, that's not true. Who can bear to be happy all the time, just to exist? Because we're losing things constantly, much as Pascal observes. This is Emily Dickinson, who gives great voice to the experience of sorrow, mortal anguish at loss itself. I will grant you that this is fairly ambiguous in some respects as to what the nature of this closure is. We can thematize it, or we can interpret it as we wish. I will hypothesize, for the purposes of our discussion today, that this speaker is mourning two decisive losses in the course of his or her existence. My life closed twice before its close. It yet remains to see if immortality unveil a third event to me, so huge, so hopeless to conceive as these that twice befell. Parting is all we know of heaven, and all we need of hell. That's enough. I would trade my entire literary legacy for the last couplet alone. So obviously, poetry serves, as does this text, as a receptacle for our anxieties about the inevitability of our own passing and the horror at losing others who have passed before us. But that's not all that poetry does. It doesn't merely soothe. It provides, as many thinkers have hypothesized, something of a temporal bridge. It's a way of connecting present with past, present with future, past with future. One of my favorite thinkers on this subject is a sadly neglected poet named Alan Grossman, who in his work The Sighted Singer offers some pretty provocative and I think enlarging, expansive notions about the relationship between poetry and death, poetry and loss. He points out here that language is inherently a principle of relationship. A very succinctly elegant statement of that. And loss is the principle of the speaking person. Speech is obtained by inscription upon the dead breath, a meddling of the exhausted air as it is pushed from the body outward. Maybe a bleak perspective, but I think poems themselves can be imagined as objects inscribed on time, much as speech is imprinted on the lost breath. You can make a compelling case, I think, that loss is the fundament or the ground of human consciousness. And because human consciousness is the ground from which poetry emerges, loss is always in the margins of everything we encounter there. More than a few people have argued, as Alan Grossman will hear, that elegy is at the root of poetic impulse, that the impetus for expression is typically epideictic. That's a complicated word that means it's an inclination toward praise or blame, to remark on the nature of the moment, but also to preserve it in some way. So Grossman continues, the keeping of the image of the person in the world is poetry's principal outcome. The most ancient poets are found making possible the recollection across time of the images of heroes, and the function of poetry is keeping alive, across the abysses of death and the difference between persons, the human image. It's not limited, as a text like this would suggest, or Horace, who in the 30th ode of the third book of his poems argues for the monumentalizing potential of poetry, but poetry as elegy, poetry as preservative of specific traces of the human image, is of course one of the primary means through which poetry does serve as a temporal bridge. This is a well-known riff on Horace by William Shakespeare in Sonnet 55, which I hope you will forgive me if I read to you now. Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme, but you shall shine more bright in these contents than unswept stone besmeared with sluttish time. When wasteful war shall statues overturn, and broils root out the work of masonry, nor Mars his sword, nor war's quick fire shall burn the living record of your memory. 'Gainst death and all oblivious enmity shall you pace forth. Your praise shall still find room, even in the eyes of all posterity that wear this world out to the ending doom. So till the judgment that yourself arise, you live in this and dwell in lovers' eyes. I think it's probably worth noting here that we obtain almost no image of the addressee. It's mostly an exercise in self-persuasion, I think. The poetry has the potential to transcend. What we mostly behold here is the power of Shakespeare's pen itself. In Sonnet 116, he says, if this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved, and I'm William Shakespeare, damn it. There's something of that bravado embedded here. But nevertheless, its ostensible purpose is to serve as a preservative of the legacy and image of one single lost soul. Here we see maybe proved out Wallace Stevenson's claim in Esthétique du Mal that death is the mother of beauty. But poetry offers us more complex ways, I would say, or maybe we should say less intuitive means through which to connect human beings across time, to bridge loss and temporality. One of my favorites of these is the notion of poetry as ritual. This comes from Roland Arthur Green, as you can see at the bottom there, and his meditation on the lyric sequence. He pays particular attention to Petrarch, but that doesn't necessarily influence our thinking here, at least in as much as this excerpt would instruct us. He emphasizes what he describes here as the lyric's ritual element, and by that he means the poem's office as directions for a performance. In performance, it may not be only compulsory, but coercive discourse. For the nature of lyric's ritual dimension, simply stated, is to superimpose the subjectivity of the scripted speaker onto the reader, as with a mask, you might say. Its ritual dimension is where lyric generally appears to remain more contemporary to its audiences than other kinds of literary discourse. It's the enactment of the poem that serves as a collective score. The poem is a timeless, infinitely repeatable act, which distributes a uniform event among actors who may otherwise be, or may be otherwise, held apart by time, space, ideology, or other divisions. This is a beautiful idea, I think, that we can wear subjectivity, subjectivity's past, subjectivity's remote, and it unifies us much as would an altar at which we perform the same ritual task. That allows me today, just before, or really frankly after I speak with you, I will teach my intermediate poetry class, and we will be reading poems written as early as the 7th century. They're BCE translated, and just a few years ago. But I can have the same experience that readers of that original text have now here. And that's a different form of preservation. It shifts our focus, of course, from the human subject, that is to say, the human image as the topic, to the speaking human being, the human object. It preserves subjectivity. I think that's glorious. I hope you're also excited about it. I can't tell. You all look very solemn. I don't know. This is really a text I'm excerpting here. Well, this is in its entirety. Just to give a sense for this. This is a poem written from the perspective of one whose work has successfully transitioned into the space of ritual. It's called From the Start. Who did I think was listening when I wrote down the words in pencil at the beginning? Words for singing to music I did not know, and people I did not know would read them and stand to sing them, already knowing them. While they sing, they have no names. I think that magnificent last line really illustrates the experience of having a subjectivity imposed upon us. It alleviates us of our own mortal anguish in some way. This is one of the chief pleasures of reading, so I find, is that it erases me and magnificently liberates me from the parameters of my own concerns, torment, deadlines, email, grading, whatever it may be. Students in the room, Victoria, I loved grading your papers, but nevertheless, I want to be clear. These things, they infringe upon my sense of serenity, but I am absolutely without an identity of my own when I am receiving the prospect of ritual from a text as I read it, as I perform it, as I sing it. And that's a magnificent temporal bridge in itself. Moving forward, we have poetry as a form of perennial experience. You might describe that as representative experience. I hesitate to call it universal experience, but poetry pulls or culls from the world moments that unify our mortal experience and provides us a rallying point or intersection between the distinctions that constitute me and the distinctions that constitute you. So this is what Kenneth Burke has to say about that very issue in his little essay, Literature as Equipment for Living, which I strenuously recommend. He begins by thinking about the nature of the parable. And from that, he kind of extracts this observation or point. It's very keen. He calls this sociological criticism, but I don't think we would accept that today, that this would be viable, so defined. Nevertheless, people find a certain social relationship recurring so frequently that they must have a word for it. Artists have developed various strategies with relation to the naming of situations. In a sense, these are timeless. For many of the typical, recurrent situations are not particular, or rather peculiar, to our own civilization at all. These situations and strategies framed in Aesop's fables, for instance, apply to human relations now just as fully as they applied in ancient Greece. They are, like philosophy, sufficiently generalized to extend far beyond the particular combination of events named by them in any one instance. They name an essence. They invariably aim to discern the general behind the particular. One fabulous example of this would be Sappho. We're not reading this specific text today, but this is an example of a poet who lived, rough contemporary of Homer, 7th century BCE. And this is translated by Mary Barnard, so in some way, she's contemporizing it. But nevertheless, I think we will find that this is a significantly representative or perennial human experience that unifies us across the passage of time. It's entitled, Thank You, My Dear. This is added really by Mary Barnard, but thank you, my dear. You came, and you did well to come. I needed you. You have made love blaze up in my breast. Bless you. Bless you as often as the hours have been endless to me while you were gone. We all, I hope, know that experience. If not, you should change your lives. But It's relatable. This is my least favorite form of criticism of anything, but it's relatable because it manifests a recognizable human event, and I can enter it in a way that unifies me across time with this subjectivity. In fact, it helps me to recognize my own markers in time by being in itself, in Burke's term, timeless. So this is a further reaction or repository that poetry can constitute in relation to mortality and the passage of time. I'll move forward maybe a little quickly. I think I've but a few minutes left to tire you. Poetry as eternity. Dean Young, goodness gracious, Dean Young is a friend of mine. Dean Norton, his first name is Dean. He is not a dean, though it befuddles his students. They're, how are you a dean? And he said, well, I'm not. But Dean Norton was kind enough to invoke a comment I made last semester in relation to poetry as a form of eternity. Now, I won't limit the applicability of that broader conceptual approach to just this episode, but I delight utterly and entirely in a very particular and distinctive essay written by a critic, a really fabulous critic who taught at the University of Minnesota, I think without as much celebrity as he deserved. An essay entitled The Lyric Present, in which he spends most of his time investigating the effect of the present tense in the lyric poem. But he's one of the first critics of whom I'm aware who observed that the present tense predominates in lyric. And he was he was very provoked by that. Why on earth would it be? We've got enough tenses in English. It's not like the only thing you can do is write in the present. But note how many of the texts we've already seen in the literary excerpts are composed in the present tense. But he draws our attention to this. And though he's speaking specifically about the present tense, I don't think that all of this depends exclusively on whether or not a poem is written in the present. The poet locates a text in a realm outside our normal conscious time world. In speech, actual speech, everyday speech, such vagueness is hardly possible. For even, forgive the typo, when we're far from clocks, I proofread it 3 times, that one I missed. Our eyes or other senses give us some awareness of the time of day and the season of the year. We always know that time, measured and unmeasured, is passing. But in poetry, we often do not know at all when the events are supposed to have taken or to be taking place. The actions described seem suspended, removed from the successiveness of our ordinary time levels, neither past, present, nor future, neither single nor repeated, but of a different dimension entirely. Among the most haunting texts composed in the Romantic period is this fragment by John Keats. It doesn't actually have a title, but it's usually just referred to by the first phrase here, this living hand. And you can feel, I think, how this level of unceasing immediacy depends on its specificity and its emphatic presence. Presentness tense-wise and presence otherwise. This living hand, now warm and capable of earnest grasping, would, if it were cold and in the icy silence of the tomb, so haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming nights, that thou would wish thine own heart dry of blood, so in my veins red life might stream again, and thou be conscience calmed. See, here it is. I hold it towards you. Oh, my God, much richer than the horrifying Keats' death mask, which I also recommend to you. He looks so calm. Is this haunted hand which protrudes from the annals of time to constantly reach out to us. It's there eternally. It will not go away. It never leaves my subconscious, I have to tell you. Whenever I teach Keats or even think about him, I just see this hand coming out like a horror movie. But there it is, absolutely and entirely present. Grossman, finally, to bring this to culmination, offers as a definition of immortality within the context of, well, you can argue that this is a kind of equivalency. Immortality, that is to say, poetic immanence or poetic indwelling, is the descent of the speaking person into the ground of language as a collective possession. And of course, language is a collective possession. So all words inscribed upon the passage of time have the potential to achieve immortality, and poetry itself obviously accentuates those, consolidates them, you might even say reduces or concentrates them with such power that immortality is indeed achievable. I'll never forget my first encounter with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which some of you guys may have read more or less recently, but it involves this maniac who's just somewhat divine. He's definitely going to die. And he cuts down an entire forest so he can inscribe his name on the stumps. He does dastardly things with relation to newlyweds. He tries to kill Enkidu. He has this fight with this like unbelievably powerful super creature. He swims endlessly to find the secret of immortality, to like a Noah equivalent who lives very remotely across an enormous body of water. And when he arrives to get the secret from Utnapishtim, I think is the name of this elder, this immortal elder, he falls asleep because he's so tired from having swum so far. So he succumbs. And I thought, man, that's a lot to do to avoid death. All we have to do, according to Alan Grossman, is write a phenomenal and memorable poem. Seems a lot easier to me. I'll leave you with one last thing, and this is A Parable of Reading, one of my favorite poems by the late Mark Strand. A weird text in some ways, but magnificent in others. And this, finally, is what poetry offers us. Reading it, that is. Down the milky corridors of fog, starless scenery, the rubble of ocean's breath, that lone figure strolling, gathering about him without shame a small flood of damages, concessions to a frailty which was his long before he knew what he must do or what he must be. And now, with his hand outstretched as if to greet the future, he comes close and pours out to me the subtlety of his meaning. And I see him, my long-lost uncle, great and golden in the sudden sunlight, who predicted that he would reach over the years and be with me, and that I would be waiting. These are the joys and immortal joys of poetry. Thank you very much.